Okay, we are live. Well, welcome to our webinar, our September webinar with a fantastic guest today. We have Scott McGregor from Something New. The topic is Nail the Follow-Up, Close More Sales. My name is Bill Kenny and our company is called Meet. And we're just delighted to have you with us today. This topic of follow-up actually came up in a sales meeting for me today. I was with I'm here in London for a couple of days on client meetings, and I was with a client and they were telling me, and unsolicited, I didn't tell them about this webinar. Maybe they've seen the emails and whatnot, but they told me how sort of challenged they are to follow up well, and ultimately frustrated because all this money is being spent to generate leads, and so they're not effectively following up. So there's some things we can do to help them with that, and I know the words that Scott is going to give us today will also help. So it's going to be exciting stuff. And so let me introduce Scott. He's the founder and CEO of Something New. Scott, I had the pleasure of meeting him maybe 4 months ago through an introduction, and immediately he impressed me with his follow-up, and just super dynamic and very thoughtful in terms of how he follows up. And it really kind of struck me as, I know there are some good lessons we can learn here. So to tell you a little bit more about Something New, Scott and his amazing team help companies nationwide and throughout the world identify and select and onboard proven high-performing sales and marketing professionals through a unique process which has earned them 3 consecutive American Business Awards for innovation. So congratulations on those accolades, Scott. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. So I know people are really curious about what you do. So maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit more about Something New. How'd you start, and who do you serve, and what do you do?
Sure. So I started Something New because I was a very frustrated vice president of sales and marketing for 17 years. I was very fortunate that the company I was with went from a startup with almost no employees to several hundred employees. So we had, pretty dramatic growth, double digits every single year for 17 straight years, which is super easy in the beginning and super hard at the end. The common denominator was that we were always looking for great talent nationwide. So I was trying to outsource things that seemed like they made sense. Talent acquisition or recruiting seemed like it made sense because every recruiter was calling us because we were growing. And I was just really dissatisfied with what I was getting. So no one really made me think about talent acquisition differently. And I always knew that, great companies are great because of their people. It's not their product. It's not their process. It's their people. It's all starts there. So I was always kind of hyper focused on that, but I really wasn't learning from the people who I felt like it was their job to teach me how to do it better. So we decided to build a better mousetrap. I think the 3 consecutive American Business Awards for innovation say that we've done that, and we're really happy with the market that we've served.
And so, what does a typical customer look like? And what, can you give us just a little bit more on
Sure.
What service you provide?
So we work primarily in the startup world. Now, the startup world, that can be a term that's used whether it's 2 guys in a garage or whether we have clients that have hundreds of employees and tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. They're still calling themselves a startup, which might be a little bit of a stretch. But we primarily work in the startup world. I think that part is probably one of the only selfish things we do. We like to work with companies where we can see the needle move. So I like the pressure of putting that first CRO, that first CMO, a salesperson, somebody in a marketing capacity, that you can actually see the fruits of your labor because you can see the result that they bring to the company. So that's exciting for us. We do work with a lot of companies that are based outside of the United States, and they've got a really good business, let's say London-based, Copenhagen, wherever the case may be, and they're really tapping into the US market for the first time, or they're really trying to expand those efforts. So we work with a tremendous amount of companies that are in that situation. And we offer them really, first, we help them build a talent acquisition foundation by giving them information that we have that people don't necessarily think about every day. And then we find them the talent. So it's a little bit like teaching somebody to fish versus giving them a fish. I think the recruiting industry in general just is hyper focused on find the talent, but they don't really help people think differently about talent acquisition. So you're building on kind of not a great foundation. So we help them think maybe at a different level when it comes to talent acquisition, and then we find them the talent they need.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like you're looking at talent acquisition in and of itself, not as an event, but more as a system, so that it's not, you know, this one critical hire that you're thinking of now, but you're really laying the groundwork to have an A team as opposed to just worrying about that single hire.
And unless a company is 100% sure that the 10, 50, or 100 employees that they have are going to be exactly the same employees next year and the year after and the year after, yes, 100%.
And you've met a lot of companies that are confident that they're going to retain people.
No. So I think that I think people understand it's a very competitive market. People, you know, on average are staying in their jobs much shorter times than they ever have before. So there's a lot of movement out there right now. It's a super strong candidate market. So I think companies know they should be thinking about talent acquisition. An interesting thing is I talk to a lot of different CEOs every single day. And if I ask them what's the most important thing to help your company scale, almost, I would say 100%, they're going to say people. But then if I ask them, how many meetings have you had in the last 30, 60, or 90 days with your senior leadership team talking about talent acquisition and how maybe you do that better? The answer is none or almost none. So it's kind of this very weird dynamic where they recognize it's the most important thing, but they're not really doing anything to make it a priority. So we help them do that. That's
awesome. So let's get into talking about FollowUp. And again, you've impressed me as somebody who, you know, for lack of a better term, I would say gets it. Your FollowUp is both thoughtful and I think right on point, timely and so on. So, and excuse the sirens. London is a place where emergency vehicles seem to operate nonstop. But our context today is around FollowUp from meeting people at events, whether we're exhibiting or speaking or walking through them or doing some one-on-one meetings or whatnot. But tell us a little bit about the type of events that you normally participate in and how you participate, just so we have some context to comments that you'll make.
So we try to participate in events where our clients are going to be. That sounds pretty basic, but so whether that's Hypergrowth, which Drift just put on, or something like Sales Machine or a Dreamforce or something like that. So anywhere where marketing and sales leaders are convening, that's where we want to be. So we go to a pretty eclectic mix of different sized events, from very large to very small, more curated events. What we do is we try to make sure that we're maximizing our ROI, and that we're very prepared. So I think a lot of companies kind of wing it, and I think that's a dangerous thing to do. So I think you've got to have a plan going in. You've got to have goals going in. You've got to already know what your follow-up's going to look like before the event even happens, and then execute on that plan. So there's a lot of different things that you can do to execute on that plan. And I don't know if you want me to get into some of the specifics.
Yeah, just a second. Maybe it's good to sort of plant a bit of an anchor out in front of us. All the actions that we take as business people, we do ultimately, I would imagine, with a purpose in mind. So let's just imagine that we've done follow-up really well. We've self-actualized with our follow-up in some way. What's the sort of best reaction, or what's the ultimate sort of outcome from really good follow-up? What can it earn us or buy us?
I think it gets you to the next step. So I view it it's like the NCAA tournament, survive in advance. So you just want to get to that next step. So I think it's understanding that sales is a process, that you're typically not going to meet somebody and they're going to sign your contract immediately. So that means there's a process, and there's rapport building that needs to be done, and there's discovery. There's a lot of listening that you need to do. And then there are steps in the process, and just making sure that you're following through on that entire process.
Yeah. And so it ultimately sounds like all of those variables, all those components really add up to, the goal being that you become trusted. And I would imagine to some degree, people are also looking for some assurance or risk reduction in terms of, if we were to work together, do business together, how do I leap into that until I have trust or some sense of risk mitigation? As you look at the whole sort of process that you all have when it comes to building or following up effectively, what are the sort of key components that you follow or look at?
I think we always want to impart no desperation. So we have kind of a philosophy of not being desperate for business, because I think like a dog smells fear, I think prospects smell when you're desperate for business. And I think if you're running your business in the correct way and you understand things are a process, you're probably not going to fall into that trap, because you're going to have a pretty robust pipeline. So it's really working through that entire process, so that they understand that we have value. And I think when you stop selling and start listening, you gain trust, because they're not used to that. They're used to getting hit in the face with a sales pitch constantly. And I think when that doesn't happen, they're almost intrigued. And when you're listening, and when you're asking smart questions, and you're trying to be a resource more than you're trying to just ram something down somebody's throat, you become a trusted advisor very quickly.
And so when it comes to sort of putting this into practice, when does follow-up start for you? You had talked about pre-planning, what kind of follow-up you're going to do. Then what happens next if we get into sort of the functional part of it?
Yep. So it definitely starts with a plan, and then executing on that plan. But the follow-up is making sure that we really have collected all the information that we need. So there's a lot of immediacy to that. It's making sure that we've got all of the information that we need. So it could be, there's a shorthand that I use for identifying people very quickly. So on the back of again, not overly sophisticated, but I do find that a lot of people, they're meeting a lot of people, they're shoving business cards in their pocket. They think they're going to remember certain things. And then at the end of an event, they've got all these business cards. They don't know who the heck anybody is. They don't really know what to do. What's the next step? So having just some sort of a shorthand, whether it's, HWC, which is, hot, warm, cold prospect, or an I if it's an influencer, little things like that, and notes that can kind of let you know, where are you and where do you need to go? What's the logical next step in the process? That's really important. Then getting that information into your CRM, or for us, it's an applicant tracking system, and making sure that that's done quickly, because I think everybody walks away from most events and you've got fistfuls filled with business cards, and it's, I'll do that data entry tonight, I'll do it over the weekend, it never gets done. So sometimes for some organizations, having somebody dedicated to putting all that information into Salesforce or Dynamics or whatever your CRM of choice is important, so that those follow-up steps can be taken and that they're timely. So, you know, speed is a critical element to follow-up.
When you leave someone's booth or leave, you know, talking to them at a networking event, you flip over the card, make a couple notes, your shorthand or code, and then, you know, when do you call them, or you know, when does that information gathering kind of get queued up to happen?
So we try to the best of our ability, and we're successful more often than we're not, to set up that next step, whether that's a cup of coffee or whether that's a sales meeting. We try to do that immediately. So let's open up our calendars. I mean, we live in a world now where, you know, people have their calendar with them, so they've got it on their mobile device, and getting that synced up. It also is a great way to figure out, it's almost like a trial close. So you get an idea whether somebody's truly interested, whether it's in, you know, building more rapport, learning more about you, and grabbing a cup of coffee or a beer or a lunch, or whether it's having that sales meeting that will take you closer to a close. I think setting things up immediately is a game changer, because there's, you know, so many situations that I've seen in the past where people say, boy, I met Bill, we had an incredible conversation, it's a love fest, we're definitely going to get together. And then when you follow up, the rep is saying, well, yeah, kind of Bill's gone dark, I can't get a hold of him, and think the wheels kind of have come off because they didn't take the step to kind of do it immediately right then and there.
That makes total sense. So we make the notes in the back of their card. Before we leave them, we've set a next step, a conversation, ideally in the next couple of days or whatever that may be. Are there other components? Are there other key sort of to-dos on the list of somebody who's good at follow-up?
I mean, we definitely, so we utilize LinkedIn to make sure that we're building some sort of credibility and rapport. We typically do it before an event. A lot of people have an idea that you really should meet somebody face-to-face before you send a connection request. I also would never send a generic connection request. So, you know, we'll say, hey, I know that you're going to be at Hypergrowth. So are we. Would love to grab a cup of coffee or a beer with you, get to know you better. It's not salesy. And then once you're connected, you know more about them. They know a little bit more about you. So you're just softening the beachhead a little bit. I think that's another critical component that needs to be done. My preference is that you do it before an event, but you know, doing it during the event or after the event very quickly is very important.
Cool. And any other forms of follow-up? I would imagine most of the time you're setting the next step while you're on this step, if that's kind of your core philosophy. But are there, you know, whether it's, you know, you've now given a proposal, or maybe there are other people within the organization you need to interview, whatever the case might be, are there any other rules that you follow with regard to follow?
So I'm traditionally kind of Sandler trained. So while I don't ascribe to everything in Sandler training, I do believe you should never leave an engagement without a clear next step. So that's always the goal, is to understand what that next step is. And to also let people know that no is okay, because I'd rather that somebody, especially if you've built rapport, you might have personal rapport, but your solution may not resonate with that person. They may not have a need. And when that happens, I think you can get strung along for a long period of time and waste an exorbitant amount of time on somebody that's not a true prospect. And, so uncovering that and letting them know that, hey, if it's no, that's okay. And we agree mutually that if this is not a fit, to go to the next step, that we're going to tell each other, as opposed to us dating for a long period of time when we both know we're kind of never going to get to the altar.
Right. Yeah, no, that maybe is the worst place to be, for sure. Yes absolutely. Or no is okay. Yep. And then a lot of people I talk to really fail from a timing standpoint. So they come back from the show, as you said, they've got cards sticking out of every pocket, and that stack of cards gets assembled probably somewhere on their desk. And as the days go on, it begins to sort of grow, spider webs and cobwebs are, engulfing it, and they, continues maybe to move to the back of the desk without a lot of action. How, from your standpoint, with regard to follow-up, how important is timing?
It's huge. Time kills all deals. So I think you have to move very quickly. I think I've heard this a lot. I hear people say, hey, I'm going to give Bill a couple days because he's just getting back from the show and he's buried with emails. And, and that's true. We all are. But if you really believe in your product or your service, and you believe that there's a solution that can really help somebody, then you probably don't want to be, the 10th person that's going to contact them. You want to be the first person. So right. It's getting out of your comfort zone a little bit, and being a little bit more aggressive, and following up maybe a little bit sooner than you might think is appropriate. But I think timely follow-up is absolutely critical.
That totally makes sense. So have you ever had a time when you feel your team didn't follow up well? Someone in your team, it just didn't, for whatever reason, it didn't work out?
Many. So we definitely learned. So I was at an ILTA conference, International Legal Technology Association conference, and we had decided to kind of cause a stir. And we had Carrie Strug, who's the Olympic gold medalist, famous for Bella Caroli, picking her up after she broke her ankle on the pole on the vault. So we had her at our booth. And needless to say, we were absolutely inundated and mobbed, people wanting to get their pictures taken and interact with her. We really weren't prepared for the volume. We missed a tremendous amount of great opportunities. So we didn't really game plan for it the way that we should have. And I think while it created a lot of buzz, we missed out on a lot of opportunities because we had a captive audience for a pretty significant period of time. So that was definitely a mistake. And I think that's just game planning. It's, anticipating, hey, what could happen? No one shows up. Okay, what do we do? Everybody at the conference shows up. Okay, what do we do? And do we have extra staff there? Do we, try to converse with people while they're in line? What are the things that we can do? And that's just game planning. And that was, 100% my fault. I didn't do a good job.
No, it's going to happen eventually, right? So what today when you game plan, and that's really, it sounds like a component of your, the sort of team training and prep for an event. How many days or weeks before the event, let's say it's, one of your larger events, how far in advance are you doing that sort of team orientation and prep?
It depends what we have for information. So sometimes we have a list of who's going to be at the event. So that's really helpful, in which case we'll get going very early on. because we're going to want to capture a tremendous amount of information prior to the event and then disseminate that throughout the team. If it's a situation where we don't have that, we'll definitely do it about a week in advance. But a lot of it is just reinforcing kind of our beliefs and how we approach an event or a show or a conference. So for us, it's that we don't pitch. We never, ever pitch initially. So we're there to listen. We're there to be a resource. And we're there to do those things to the extent that we're then going to be asked, hey, what do you do? Or, hey, I really appreciate that that offer of an introduction to somebody who's valuable to me. Hey, Bill, what do you do? Tell me a little bit about you. It almost always happens, and it never puts you in the situation where you're kind of that person with a fistful of your own business cards going up to people and shaking their hand and saying, hey, let me tell you all about something new. It's just, to me, it's the wrong approach.
Right. That's sort of second only to the person that's handing out their resume.
Exactly. Exactly. Which happened.
Yeah, exactly. So, and are there, obviously you're working with a lot of clients that are going to events as well, and you may not see this as much, but do you see, and it may not even be clients, people you're walking up to at events, what are the common mistakes that you see or observe when you go to trade shows in the follow-up that others are doing to you?
I think people aren't timely. People aren't transparent. So they may not be, very forthcoming with exactly what they're trying to accomplish. So that could be something. That's definitely something that I notice. People are always pitching, so they're always ready to kind of give that pitch. That doesn't really fit with me all that well. I like somebody who wants to learn about my business, my company, how they can be a resource, and then they'll have ample opportunity, if their solution makes sense, for us to partner and do business.
That makes a lot of sense. So maybe go in just a slightly different direction here. Now, I know you had mentioned that somebody in your organization, I think you did, is responsible to data enter in the cards that you and your team have marked up with the various codes. But is there someone who's responsible to track follow-up and to make sure, to have some sort of assurance that all of the opportunity that is being identified at an event is realized?
So that's really up to each individual, but they're not just winging it. So we have a playbook that really walks somebody through every step in our process. So it's I don't know if you ever had this assignment in school, but it's a typical assignment, which is, Bill, tell me how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So, one kid says, well, you just put peanut butter on the bread and you put jelly on the bread, you smash it together, you're done. And then the teacher says, well, Billy, don't you have to take the peanut butter out? Don't you have to unscrew the lid? Don't you have to get a knife? Don't you have to take the jelly out of the refrigerator? So our playbook is more along the lines with what the teacher's looking for, which is, what is every possible step in the process and what do we do? So that's already mapped out for everybody. So while everybody individually is responsible for follow-up, they're all working off of the same playbook.
Right. Yeah, no, as I recall, when we did that exercise in school, we actually did it so that everybody would write down their instructions, and then the teacher brought out, loaves of bread, peanut butter, and jelly, and your job was to actually follow the instruction that your buddy wrote. And we had peanut butter and jelly that was being applied. The bread hadn't even come out of the bag, and it was being applied to the table and
right.
Whatever. And I love it.
Yeah,
no, it was brilliant. You really, that brought to life how important writing processes and systems are, and how literal we need to be, for sure. So how did that start? Because it's interesting. I think most companies, even larger companies that we see, haven't gone to the extent of really, I would say, automating. Not that it's mechanical in any way, but systematizing something as sort of functional as FollowUp. How did you get to the place where, for you, FollowUp became sort of so important and something that you wanted to be, I'm assuming as somewhat of a differentiator? What spurred that?
So, I mean, putting that all in a playbook and having those steps really well defined, I think it was important, because I knew that as we grew, doing that was going to be 1,000 times more painful. And I think that's what happens is most companies say, well, we're going to do that, down the road, we'll develop this playbook. Our playbook is kind of a living, breathing document. So it changes, I would say, every week. We're tweaking something or we're adding something to it. And if you do that when you're small, you really can scale and it can grow with you, rather than, you wait until you've got 40, 50, 100 employees, then you try to do it. Then it's a Herculean task to try to do that. So I think it was recognition and, hopefully wishful thinking on my part that we were going to grow and we were going to have pretty high growth and a lot more employees, and that it was better to do it when we were a one-man shop, which is what we did. Literally put it together when it was, I started it when it was just me starting the business. And it's really helped us scale.
Well, and it's bad when you have to put yourself in timeout when you don't follow your own rules. That's never good.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, having that is key. And I would imagine part of the philosophy in doing it, besides, I would imagine at the core of the reason to do it is that you want the marketplace to have the same or as close to the same experience with something new, independent of who they're working with or who is following up with them, so that it's not, Joe's follow-up system and Sam's follow-up system, or lack of a system, but that irrespective of who they're working with, they get a very common, high quality, something new follow-up. Is that sort of part of the objective?
It's a big part of it. And I think you see that, to use a different analogy, you see that in restaurant chains. McDonald's probably the most famous for it, which is, whether you're in Wichita or whether you're in Washington or anywhere in between, you're going to get the same hamburger, you're going to get the same French fries. For us, because we have people all over the country and we do national searches, we want that experience, whether it's the client experience or the candidate experience, we want it to be the same, whether they're talking to Diane in Minnesota or whether they're talking to Rachel in Boston or they're talking to Phil in New York. We want that to be the same. So while everybody has little different nuances that they bring, because we want the personalities to be there, they're all following the same playbook, so that the follow-up is exactly the same.
That makes total sense. So I'd like to jump to the pre-submitted audience questions. We don't have a live audience for this recording, so we've got a decent amount of pre-submitted questions. Some of them are not necessarily questions, and there are obviously some that are going into the same area. So I'm going to condense these just a little bit to sort of make sure, number one, they're actual questions, and two, that we don't get too redundant. So the first one here is essentially how do I stand out with my follow-up emails? The idea being that that, as you said, somebody's going to get 10 or even hundreds of follow-ups from an event. How does an individual stand out? in that all that noise?
I think there's surprisingly less noise than you would imagine. I don't know the statistic, but I see this posted quite a bit, and it's the amount of times the average person actually follows up. And it's surprisingly low versus what you need to do to actually get to the sale, which is, 8 follow-ups or whatever the number is. So I think, as simple as this is, just actually following up. I mean, how many people say, I'll call you or I'll do this, and then they drop the ball and they don't do it? So I think we're almost conditioned, we're surprised when somebody actually follows through and does what they say they're going to do. So I think it's sometimes it's that simple, is just actually doing it. And knowing that others won't. I think the other components are, making sure that you're not salesy, and that you've really listened to them and you've figured out not what you want to be the next step, but what they want the next step to look like. I think too often we're focused on our agenda versus really, and it's a function typically of we haven't really done a great job listening. Or we haven't really done a good job in discovery and figuring out what's important to them and making sure that we're giving them the appropriate next step for them, not for us.
So, this question actually, and your response makes me think of maybe a couple other questions. So, obviously at an event, we want to set the next step while we're there in front of someone. We both take out our calendars and we do that. But there are going to be other kinds of follow-up we might do from an email we send them, looking for more information, or follow-up we might do once they have a proposal, and so on. And we've preset next steps, but those, not everybody is responsive when we hope they are. So when you follow up, the normal today is we send somebody an email, and that may be what this person's referring to, partly in terms of, how do I stand out, either in writing a better email or maybe using a different mode of communication, phone, smoke signals, something different.
Right.
What do you have some thoughts on that in terms of maybe, modes of communication that might help us be different and get through more effectively?
I do. I think the phone is really underutilized, and there's a hierarchy of communication, and I think as you get into email and text and things like that, you're really the communication is degrading each time. Because you're not hearing the inflection of somebody's voice, and there's so much that you lose. So face-to-face is the best, but I would say there's not enough people that are following up on the phone. The number of times that my phone rings, and it's somebody who wants to talk to me versus somebody who's going to send me an email, I'm in the ratio might be 200 to 1. People very rarely call me. My phone number is on LinkedIn. It's on my profile. It's very easy to get, but people very rarely will pick up the phone and call. So I think you're going to get lost in a sea of email. Text is actually, even though I think it's a lower form of communication, it's something that is becoming a little bit more common in business, and people are a lot more responsive. So just think of the number of texts you get in a day versus the number of emails you get in the day. So email, I just think, is a completely oversaturated way of communicating. And unless you're a really good writer and your messaging is spot on, email is probably my least favorite way to follow up. I'd rather do it with a phone call than anything else.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think the idea that you're hearing tone, as you said, inflection, makes so much difference. And I guess the follow-up to that, and I was hoping you were going to say phone, so I'm glad, and I was almost certain you would. So every once in a while I hear from salespeople that when they call and they get voicemail, they don't leave a message. And this is, it always has been curious for me that somebody would leave a message. I don't know how you would ever call anybody back or know that they called you if you don't leave a message. But do you have a philosophy on that about leaving messages or not?
I do. So I think you should leave a message. I think the amount of callbacks you're going to get when you don't are zero.
100% of the time.
Yeah. So that doesn't make a lot of logical sense to me. I think it's really what you leave. I see nothing wrong with leaving a message. So I do that all the time. And my callback rate is actually pretty high. So yeah, I don't know why people believe, yes, I don't know that repetitive nonstop voicemails is the appropriate way to communicate, but certainly leaving a message, to me, there's nothing wrong with it.
Sure. And again, they're going to hear your tone and all that, which ideally is good. And I would imagine when you're communicating via voicemail, it would be sort of a similar empathy that you would exhibit, showing that you listened and that you're working on something that you've heard is high value for them, so that there's a strong value proposition for the person you're addressing. Is that a fair estimation?
Yes. I think in any way that you communicate, making sure that the tone in your voice is not one of desperation. It's almost like, listen, I don't really care if you call me back or not. I think that's intoxicating to people, because, people smell desperation like a dog smells fear. And, those people that call you, you could tell, it's end of the month, end of the quarter, they've got to make a sale. And that's really why they want to get you back on the phone, versus somebody who's a little bit more casual in the way that they leave it. I think it has a much better impact.
That's great. So another question here is what's the proper timeline for follow-up? I think we answered this, but let's make sure we hit it right between the eyes. How soon should we follow up?
Immediately. So hopefully you're getting that next step so that you've got buy-in on when that will be. But if that doesn't happen, because it's not always practical, and it's not always a lengthy conversation that you've had with somebody, so it may be a very brief encounter, but you still want to follow up, I would say absolutely do it much sooner than your brain is telling you to do it. So I think you want to jump right on that, because somebody's going to call them first. Somebody's going to send them some sort of a communication, and it might as well be you.
Totally makes sense. So here's another one, and this one we certainly hear challenges with periodically, and this may go slightly outside of follow-up and maybe just a first contact. This may be setting the appointment while we're going to be at an event with someone, and sometimes these questions come in as more just comments as much as anything, but this was getting in touch with key decision makers. So when you think about, and it may be specific to follow-up or even just sort of a general getting a key decision maker to either, number one, take your call or return your call. What are the sort of important keys or elements to that?
I think you've got to understand what makes them tick, what's important to them. You've got to feel like you're bringing and adding value. Everybody talks about selling to the C-suite, but most people don't. And I think they don't because they don't really feel like they can add value, or they maybe don't understand kind of what that person's challenges are. So it's just as simple as what you do with everybody, which is trying to put yourself in their shoes, understand what their roles and responsibilities are, what are the problems they face, how can you help them, how can you be a resource, and then not being afraid to follow up at that level.
Right. Cool. And is there a point just to that? Is there a point when your follow-up stops? In other words, you drop the follow-up?
I think when, there are times when, and this, I think you figure this out as your sales career typically progresses, that you understand when you're kind of never going to get to the altar. And you may not want to abandon that relationship entirely, because there may be value in that relationship in terms of introductions, or, I think obviously you never want to burn a bridge. But I think knowing when something's never really going to get where you need it to go, so that you can focus your energy on something that's real is important. But also understanding that there's a different process and a different timeline for a lot of different situations. So enterprise-sized accounts are typically going to take a lot longer. They're a lot more nuanced. And so them not giving up as quickly versus smaller, more transactional opportunities where they're going to reach a decision pretty quickly. And if that decision is a no, and you understand why it's a no, and it makes rational sense, then, I think it's time to move on to something else that can bear more fruit.
That's great. So let's just talk for a moment on the lead handling process. So you go to an event, your team, maybe there are 3 or 4 or 5 of you at an event. Everybody meets the people they meet. They come back from the event with their stack of cards. It sounds to me like those cards go to a central person. And then how does that information get back out to I'm assuming each individual handles their own follow-up. But how does that sort of process sort of functionally work? From the point of I'm one of your people, I've got my leads. What happens and how do I get back and sort of re-engaged with that information?
So in my old organization, we were geographically based. And when we were not geographically based, it was named accounts. So that was relatively easy. If it fell within that geography, then we knew who it was going to. If it was, a client that was on somebody's list, well, then it was going to go to them. We don't really operate that way now. So people that are going were much smaller. So, people that are going to the event, it's really whatever you're capturing, you're starting to build that relationship. And unless somebody is actively working on that account, which we track through our ATS system, then that's their lead.
And so if I come back with my cards, do I give those to somebody for data entry, or do I do it myself? And then how do I get that back if I hand them off?
So in the past, because we were going to larger shows and I had a very, very large sales team, we had a central person that was putting all that information in. Now everybody does it themselves. That's
their own. So it never sort of leaves the individual. Okay, that's great. Cool. Well, I think we've covered all of the questions, at least I think in a pretty solid way here, and we may get more that come in via email later. But so, if there were a summary thought or two that you have about follow-up and nailing it, making sure that we create or begin building the bridge to trust with the people we're meeting, what are sort of any kind of final closing thoughts that you'd have?
I would say be timely, be relevant. So there's a lot of what I mean by be relevant is there's too much, hey, I'm just checking in. What does that really mean? What are you checking in? Be relevant in terms of why are you kind of communicating with them again? What is that next step? Make sure that it's relevant to them, that you're not just kind of throwing the line out there and fishing and saying, hey, I'm just checking in. And it's just a way, it's kind of a weak way to see where somebody's at. So timeliness is absolutely critical. I think being relevant, being transparent, those are all keys to great follow-up.
Those are fantastic. Well, let me just make one other comment, and then we'll sign off here. But for those that are on, our next webinar will be October 23rd, and the topic is walking the trade show floor, how to get value when you can't exhibit. So we can't exhibit at every event, and this is really about how do we engage with people on the floor. To some of what Scott was saying, how do we prepare and make sure that when we get to these events, we are ultra effective and our time is well spent, and we kind of get the results that we intend. So with that, Scott, this has been an exceptional pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to educate us more in terms of follow-up, and I know our audience will really appreciate it. Are there, in closing, I guess, are there, as our team is out there, if they hear a particular kind of need that one of their clients has, what would indicate to them that they should pass that off to you?
Yeah, I think if there's any company out there that's looking for sales talent or marketing talent, we'd love to have a conversation, and that's all it is. Not everybody's going to be a fit. We do things in a very different way. I think it does resonate with most people, but not everybody's going to be able to use an external resource like us. But it's certainly, if people are looking for great sales and marketing talent, we're definitely a great and interesting alternative. And I would say that if anyone has a sales team and you're top grading, you've always got low performers. And like any NFL team or sports team would do, and this isn't cold-hearted, you've really got to be trying to figure out a way to replace them with a higher performer. So everybody should be in the market for great sales talent.
Absolutely. So just a funny story on that. A couple of years ago, I saw Jim Cook, the founder of Sam Adams Beer and Boston Beer Company, speak. And he had a human resource philosophy that he said after 20 years, they've not necessarily figured it out, but they've evolved to this. And when they have a new hire, they ask one question in the department they're hiring, and that is, does this individual bring our average up? And if the answer isn't emphatically yes, then they're not the right fit, and they move on. Yeah. So I thought it's something really simple for sure.
I love it.
Yeah, it was cool. But with that, thank you so much for spending some time with us here today, Scott, and we'll look forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it.
All right, enjoy.
Take care.